Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to the Impact of Emotions on Adherence webinar. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. However, you may submit questions at any time today by typing them through the chat feature, which is located to the left of your screen. We'll be fielding questions at the end of the presentation, and as a reminder, today's call is being recorded and will be offered at the conclusion of our event. I'd like to take this time to introduce you to John Mitchell, Senior Director of Healthcare. John has 25 years of market research experience and has worked for the past 12 years in the pharmaceutical industry. He's worked both client-side and vendor-side for some of the leading market research firms. He helped start 2 market research firms, one of which grew to 60 employees in 3 years. John has a BA from Hampshire College and has an MBA in healthcare management from Yale University. John, please go ahead.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming, and I appreciate your willingness to participate in this webinar today. This presentation was developed by myself and Scott von Lutgen of Merck. Scott leads the customer strategy team and does a lot of work on adherence at Merck, so he did want to get involved in how this was put together, and he couldn't be here today, so I'm presenting it on my own. First, today we will show you some background information on non-adherence. Then we will present a custom patient study we did. That study included 100 people with diagnosed diabetes and 100 with diagnosed high cholesterol. We were looking to understand underlying emotional structure in the patient's relationship with physician, disease, and medication. Now, who we are. BuzzBack has been at the forefront of developing innovative online techniques that engage respondents and uncover richer insights since 2000. For this study, we used several of our proprietary techniques, including e-collage, blobs, and thought bubbles, and I'll explain those in more detail later when we get to the results. Here you see the traditional categories of non-adherence. Either patients never bother to fill the first script they get, or they get confused about how to take their medication, or simply decide not to take the medication correctly. Most importantly, they often stop taking the medication far too soon and essentially disappear from the system, whether temporarily or long-term. Over time, nearly 50% of patients stop taking their meds early without consulting their physician. Now imagine the implications if Lipitor, for example, with total lifetime sales well over $200 billion, had increased adherence among patients by just 10%. The potential impact of small gains in adherence can be astounding. How many heart attacks and hospitalizations also might have been prevented? So there's a benefit obviously to the pharmaceutical companies, and people will point the figure and say, well, pharmaceutical companies working on adherence are only out there to benefit themselves, but in fact the overall societal gain of improved adherence is very, very broad and very, very profound. On this chart, you have on the left levels of unfulfilled first prescriptions by therapeutic category. Notably for our study, the level of unfilled first prescriptions for both circulatory disease and for diabetes is above 30%. On the right, we show overall non-adherence for selected categories. So cholesterol non-adherence is above 40%, and type 2 diabetes is around 35% overall. Now these data come from 2 different studies, and so you see there are different categories here. On the left was a study of EHR data, and on the right a study of secondary claims data as well. The question here is, so why do people fall into non-adherence, or just simply stop taking their medication? On the top, I put this into very, very simple terms because I think that, simple terms are the best way to communicate with patients, and I'm not pandering to patients or talking down to them when I think of this, but I think the simpler the better. So I figured we'd represent this process in that way. So on the top you have and really the patient talks to the doctor and just walks out of the office, and very often it's been shown has no idea what the doctor has said to them, whether because they don't understand the terminology that the doctor is using or because they're so fraught with anxiety and tension when they're in that setting that nothing goes in, nothing gets absorbed. On the other hand, you have a large proportion of people who believe that medication is in fact chemical poison, that there are better ways, alternative ways, more natural ways to treat disease, and that these chemical entities, as they are known, are in fact, rather than curing them or improving their condition, they're actually destroying their health in the long term. And then you have the oops factor, which is long known. People forget to take their medication, they forget to get their refills, they're just too busy, they're forgetful, there's a whole variety of reasons for this oops factor. And then there's really the trust issue, which goes back into the issue, which is the relationship between the patient and the physician, the patient and the overall medical establishment. Patients have a hard time believing it also ties into this whole notion of poison. So there's really a lot of factors that come into play, and what you see on the right-hand side of this chart is what happens then when patients do fall off therapy. And the top thing really is very often they end up in the hospital, for cardiovascular disease, for diabetes, etc. Hospitalization is really the quickest end result to non-adherence. And they go to the doctor, they go to urgent care, they end up in long-term care rather than being able to live at home anymore. And far too frequently people actually do die as a result of their non-adherence. Looking at the overall U.S. health market, so the U.S. economy generates about $15 trillion worth of activity any given year, and health spend in 2013 was $2.7 trillion. The total cost of non-adherence has been estimated. Some people use the figure that is around $110 billion. I tend to use the figure of $310 billion. There's two different methodologies. I'm not going to get into that right now, but they do focus on different aspects of non-adherence. The larger number is obviously more striking, and I like to use it to get people's attention. So overall spend, as you see in the left, is divided, the biggest share is in hospitals at about $900 billion, doctors at about $600 billion. When non-adherence causes a result that ends up as a medical issue, a further medical issue, hospitals become the largest factor here. So nearly 2/3 of all non-adherence ends up in a hospitalization. When trying to deal with non-adherence, whether it be institutions, government, pharmaceutical companies, insurers, the largest share of activity is in either educational or behavioral programs. I think everybody probably understands what those are, but I'll just summarize them. So educational can be communication efforts that explain to patients, what are the issues in their illness and what are the things that they need to do to improve that. You can have doctors talking to patients, providing them with patient information kits. And then behavioral programs are more focused on how do you get patients to actually do the repetitive functions that are needed in order to get them to take their medication over time. And modern initiatives on that end, you can see this picture on the right. You have this watch that reminds people to take their insulin, or you have an e-cap that flashes a light when it's time to take their medication. You have text messaging. So these kinds of things are major efforts. And then you have provider functions, so people working with doctors to help them work better with their patients, much smaller component. And then effective programs are the ones where people are working with patients on a more emotional, functional level of their lives and trying to deal with the issues that prevent them from being responsive to the larger behavioral or educational programs. And there are many issues that come up with patients